I know that Final Fantasy XVI has its very vocal haters, but Anabella Rosfield is genuinely one of my favorite villains of all time. She's Clive's mother, so she adds heavy personal stakes to the story. She works so well as an intentionally hateable character, and I can't fix her, but she can definitely ruin my life. If she needs a dog, I can bark. What do you mean this woman is 52? But that's not why you clicked on this video. You thought this was a video about Ultima, so why did I open with 25 seconds about Anabella? Maybe some of you are thinking you clicked on the wrong video, or that I've developed dementia or something. Nope. Well, hopefully not at least. Wait, what was I talking about? When I started replaying Final Fantasy XVI to get notes and footage for this video, I was originally focusing on Anabella, because as I just said, she truly is one of my favorite villains of all time, and I thought that she deserved a video on her. And so I played through the game, making sure to take good notes whenever she appeared on screen. And as soon as I finished up with Twinside, my motivation to continue the game just stopped. I did one more session the day after, cleaning out the Akashic enemies from various places around Storm, but I was done with what I'd wanted to do. I'd gotten my footage for Anabella, so I moved on and continued with my Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough. I was still enjoying the game and knew that I was pretty close to the end, but I also remembered not feeling particularly attached to the last act of the game during my first playthrough, so I just kinda put the game down. But when I came to write the script for an analysis on Anabella, that little bit of unfinished game was bothering me. The assault on Twinside was some of the most exciting storytelling I'd experienced recently because of how climactic it felt to finally close off Anabella's arc, but for my impression of Ultima to be so non-existent that I didn't even feel like finishing the game bothered me. So I loaded the game back up and finished the last 8 to 10-ish hours, all so that I could get to the root of how Final Fantasy XVI simultaneously had one of my favorite villains and one of my most forgettable villains, and to answer the one burning question I had in my mind. Was Ultima really that bad? Now, I still put in the work to learn about Anabella, and I don't want to just abandon all of that, so I wanted to start off with a short section focusing on her, and perhaps it'll help highlight the frustrations I have with how Ultima was handled later on. As I mentioned in the intro, she genuinely is one of my favorite villains. If you've seen my short about my top 5 favorite video game villains, you'll know that I placed her at number 4, and I stand by that. She immediately forms a strong emotional connection with the player when we see how hostile she is towards Clive, her firstborn son, and then the twist that she was behind the attack on Phoenix Gate where Joshua was supposedly killed is an incredible hook that really piqued my interest when I first played the demo, and I couldn't wait for the full game to release. And she did not let me down. Her ruthlessness shows when she keeps Clive as a slave for the next 13 years, branding him so that anyone would immediately recognize him as being capable of magic, a faux pas to those living in Valisthea, effectively dooming his life outside of his service to Rosaria. She's never quite at the forefront of the story development again, but she still fills her role nicely. She's in the background, appearing with her new husband Sylvester Lesage, Emperor of Sanbreque, and her new son, Olivier, whom she has this weird obsession with. And every time she made an appearance, my eyes were glued to the screen. I was intrigued by her and was hungry for any developments involving her. Why she betrayed Rosaria, what her ultimate plan was, why she was so obsessed with Olivier. I was left wanting for more every time she showed up on screen. And then the attack on Twinside was an incredible conclusion to her arc. Clive finally confronts his mother for the first time after breaking free from her servitude, and she shows her whole hand. She doesn't have any sympathetic reasons for the way she is, she's simply a horrible person.
We weren't even testing for that.
And yet still tries to twist the narrative to garner sympathy and understanding. She's so out of touch with reality and delusional with her own self-importance that she thinks she can appeal to Clive like this. But to Clive, it's all meaningless bullshit. He calls her out, pointing that if she bothered to look out the window, she'd realize Joshua is very much alive. After Clive's detour to calm down Bahamut, when Dion looks up and sees Ultima where everyone else sees Olivier and chucks his spear through Anabella's third son, she realizes that she truly has nothing left. Her husband had sacrificed his life to save Olivier from Dion earlier, Olivier was dead now, and Twinside had fallen to the Dragoons. She had no more family and no more power. Joshua tries to urge her to escape with them, but rather than let herself feel humiliated as a nobody or a prisoner, she opts to take her own life.
Get away from me! This is all just a dream, just a bad dream! You will not take me, Shadow! You will not take me!
But unfortunately, while this was a very high peak of the story for me, the rest of the game couldn't live up to the level of tension and excitement that I experienced here. Obviously, with Anabella exiting the story here, we need a new main villain, and I'd say something cool like enter Ultima here, but he kind of entered the story a while ago when we destroyed the first Mother Crystal, so let's just awkwardly and suddenly shift the main focus of the video over to Ultima, kind of like the game did. In order to be fair to Ultima, I feel like a bit of background on him is necessary. So here's a somewhat abridged version of who he is, what he's doing, and why he's doing it. Afterwards, I'll recommend another video to look into if you're interested in a more complete analysis of Ultima. Ultima and his species came from elsewhere on the planet outside of Valisthea, and they existed sometime over 5,000 years ago. They developed magic, powered by drawing ether from the air, and with it created civilization. But unfortunately, their magic had a drawback, in which the ether they drew from the earth was lost. I suppose the law of conservation of energy doesn't exist in this world, leaving their lands stripped of ether and unable to support life. This symptom came to be known as the Blight, marked by the lands turning pitch black. They drew so much ether that the Blight had almost entirely consumed their homeland, and so 16 of Ultima's species pilot origin around the world in search of new lands. They came across Valisthea, yet untouched by the Blight, but despite this, so few of them were remaining that their species was doomed to die out. In order to save their species, they came up with a plan to cast Wraiths, an ultimate spell to resurrect their lost brethren, but it would require an enormous amount of ether. To gather enough ether, 8 of them shed their aging bodies and dispersed across Valisthea and transformed into the Mother Crystals, monolithic crystals which would gradually accumulate ether from the land. While the Mother Crystals were gathering ether, Ultima created humans. Casting the spell would require a physical form, and as their own bodies were deteriorating, a new body was needed. Ultima planted the seeds of mythos inside humanity, with the hopes that it would awaken in one of the humans somewhere down the line, and they might be capable of hosting Ultima's soul and casting rays. With their plan in motion, Ultima sealed Origin and himself away while the Mother Crystals were gathering enough ether. Skipping ahead to 10 years prior to the game's prologue, Ultima forms an alliance with Barnabas Tharmer, King of Waloed, turning the king Akashic and essentially into one of Ultima's thralls. Continuing to the game's events, it appears that Clive has awakened as this mythos, evidenced by Ultima showing up and calling him this every time Clive destroys a Mother Crystal. And the first time we see him during the raid on the Oriflamme Mother Crystal, he kills Sid. During the first time skip, Anabella has a son with Sylvester Lesage, Olivier, whom Ultima secretly turns Akashic shortly after his birth. When Olivier is 11, his half-brother, the dominant of Bahamut, Dion, manages to see through him and realizes that Olivier isn't a simple child and tries to kill him twice. The first time was shortly before the attack on Twinside, where their father Sylvester jumps in the way of Dion's spear, sacrificing his life for his son. And then the second time is during the attack on Twinside, where once again he throws his spear at Olivier, but this time there's nobody to block it, and Olivier is killed right in front of Anabella. Clive chases Barnabas to Ash and the Kingdom of Waloed, but Ultima had enacted the next stage of his plan and turned the whole continent Akashic. Barnabas waits for Clive at Reverie, where he tests Clive and lets Clive kill him and absorb the powers of Odin, in order to prepare Clive to be the perfect vessel for Ultima. Clive then continues onward to the capital of Waloed to destroy the final Mother Crystal. As he approaches it, Ultima pulls him and Joshua into the interdimensional rift and explains most of what I just explained in the last few minutes, and tells Clive that humanity has no place in the new world, save for him, Mythos. Obviously, Clive and Joshua disagree with Ultima here, and so they fight him.
My friends, my family, we have all suffered, all fought to survive. This world may be flawed, it may be broken, but it's all we have. And if we can't share it, I see only one other choice. You have to go.
You may have created us, Ultima. But it's time we lived on our own terms. This isn't your world anymore.
Clive and Joshua are able to push back Ultima for now, and Ultima sends Clive into this weird dreamlike state while he flees to Origin. After some final preparations, Clive, Joshua, and Dion follow him to Origin for a final showdown where Clive conquers him and shows humanity's will to live. Again, that was a slightly abridged version of Ultima's story, just to give a bit of context for what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video. Before I start getting critical though, Fat Brett has a good video on Ultima, and he does a much more complete analysis on him, so if you're interested in that, be sure to go check him out. Now, if you've listened to what I said and thought, oh, he doesn't sound like such a bad character, well, you're probably right. None of his character sounds inherently bad to me. His backstory is fairly interesting, we have personal stakes in defeating him because of Cid's death, but yet for a lot of people he managed to fall short. Now, writing is obviously very subjective, and I'm a firm believer that there are no bad ideas in storytelling, and virtually anything can work if executed well enough. So with that in mind, I'm not going to try and nitpick at his story, as I don't think it'd really point out anything. Instead, I think there are three main factors that contribute to him feeling underwhelming. Execution, how well his story is told, expectations, does his character line up with the themes of the game and fit into its structure, and where the information is presented. For this video, I'm primarily going to focus on the second of those factors, expectations, as, for me at least, I believe it's the one that affects my opinion of Ultima the most. I'm going to say this up front, and then, hopefully, justify my opinion with the rest of the video. Ultima as a character felt incredibly disconnected from the major plot threads that had intrigued me with this game. Now, I know there are several themes that he does tie into, so I can't say he was a complete failure in this aspect, but the jump from Anabella's arc to Ultima's arc was so sudden and so jarring that I really struggled to care for the last act of the game. I said it at the start, I'll say it 10 more times at least throughout the video, Anabella was by far the most interesting character in the story for me. Her behavior and actions in the prologue got me hooked, and her relationship with Clive was such an important factor in so much of what happened. And the first 70% of the game played into this. We had an intriguing political storyline, multiple warring nations vying for control over Valisthea, and ownership of the Dominants and Bearers. Benedicta and Hugo were great supporting antagonists to hold me over while slowly being drip-fed anything to do with Anabella, and we got hints of the greater mysteries of Valisthea each time we destroyed a Mother Crystal. But as I said earlier, the assault on Twinside was both my favorite moment in the story and also where it began to let me down. As exciting a moment as Clive finally confronting his mother was, she's just completely forgotten about afterwards. It's almost entirely as if she didn't exist. There's no mourning from Clive and Joshua for their mother, no relief that this shadow looming over their shoulders was gone, No celebration for the death of the bitch who abused and neglected her children and used them for her own gain. Literally any form of closure. Clive, Jill, Joshua, Wade, all characters that really feel like they should have reacted to her death in some meaningful way, but as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, the only character to bring up Anabella after Twinside is Ultima in one single line of dialogue in the interdimensional rift.
It is what you were born to do, why we nursed you and fed you, as your own mother should have.
And neither Clive nor Joshua even react to her being acknowledged. After her death, it feels like she may as well have not existed in the game world. She doesn't even appear in the weird dream that Clive has after his fight with Ultima. Plenty of other deceased characters make an appearance. Sid, Benedicta, Hugo, Barnabas, Elwyn, Harbord, but for some reason there's no Anabella. The game just forgot to give us the conclusion to her arc that I was expecting and instead rushes us into Ultima's arc, never acknowledging a lot of the journey that got us here. It's extra bizarre to me because Ultima even has some strong ties to Anabella through Olivier. It would have been an excellent opportunity to bridge the gap and ease the transition between the two arcs, and help what was such a major character in the earlier parts of the game actually feel like they had an impact in the world. Another issue that I want to touch on just really briefly is the final factor that I mentioned earlier, and that's how and where Square chose to present a lot of the information regarding Ultima. To quote this guy on Reddit, just off cutscenes alone, Ultima fucking sucks. If you study the lore like you don't have a life, he's not too bad. Now, I don't think it's quite as extreme as they make it out to be, but it at least vaguely illustrates my point. A lot of what I'd say critical information about Ultima is hidden in the data log or the Ultimania. Now, I don't mind rewarding people with extra context as a bonus, but not when it comes at the cost of what feels like an incomplete character. Going back to my original point of expectations, I think a few comparisons to some other villains will help highlight what I'm trying to say. First up, Vena from Final Fantasy XII. 12 and 16 both have heavily political storylines that transition into, and I'll quote Jason Schreier on this one, magical nonsense. But that magical nonsense in FF12 didn't come at the cost of what the game had been building up thus far. It's not like Vayne died while we were at Gira Vegan only to never be mentioned again while Vena is the only relevant enemy after that. In 16, the magical nonsense completely replaces the political themes of the story, whereas in 12 it complements it. Vayne is established as bad guy number 1 from the outset, and despite Vena's introduction, he's never usurped from this role and remains relevant the whole game. And importantly, he keeps his own character. I'm sorry, Barnabas, you're going to have to catch a stray here, but Barnabas basically turns into an Ultima fangirl, and I felt a lot of his character kind of just disappeared towards the end. Another good comparison, I think, is Anabella Rosfield and Luca Blight. Both characters are initially presented as the main antagonist, and both are killed off around 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the story. But the game still respects Luca Blight's presence after he's killed. The damage he did to Dunan doesn't disappear after he dies, and the rest of Suikoden 2 is spent trying to repair the damage that he had done to the world. Whereas when Anabella dies, the world forgets about her. Nobody acknowledges her passing or how her actions had impacted anyone outside of a single line by Ultima. Another comparison is Ultima to Kuja. For the first disc of FF9, Queen Braun is our main antagonist, but at the end of disc 1 it's revealed that she's been secretly working with a man named Kuja, and we get to see their working relationship from then until Queen Braun's death at the end of disc 2. FF9 has a revolving door of villains. Garland appears near the start of disc 3, and for a bit it looks like he might take over as the main villain, but Kuja kills him off. And then Necron famously appears out of nowhere to act as the game's final boss. But none of these other villains significantly detract from each other. Braun and Kuja working together strengthens both characters. Garland was Kuja's creator and tries to control him in Zidane, but Kuja rebels and kills Garland. Necron, I'm not going to say he's an incredible character. The most common opinion of him is probably confusion rather than praise, but he doesn't make Kuja a worse character simply for existing. Braun's death causes Dagger to become depressed for half of Disc 3, which has a real gameplay impact, constantly reminding us of Braun's presence in the story. And cutting her hair to symbolize that she's moved on from her mother's death gives us a proper resolution to Braun's arc. You already know where I'm going with this. Where is any of this treatment for Anabella's death? Ultima doesn't improve Anabella as a character, and Anabella doesn't improve Ultima as a character. There was some obvious potential. Her son Olivier provided a way to tie the two together, but he just doesn't. Instead, we get to sit in the hotel lobby staring at Ultima through the window for the first 70% of the game, and then Anabella trips and falls backwards into the revolving door just as Ultima tries to walk in right as the hotel staff start locking up for the night, leaving her out in the street to be picked up by the garbage collector tomorrow morning. 3 examples of a situation like this being handled better in my opinion, 2 of them not just from the same company, but the same franchise as Final Fantasy XVI. And the frustrating thing is, Ultima isn't the reason I don't particularly care for Ultima. His story is great, his design is great, his voice acting is fantastic. In a vacuum, he's great. But he doesn't exist in a vacuum. He exists in Final Fantasy XVI. In the same world as Anabella, Sylvester, Hugo, etc. So when his character doesn't clearly fit into that world, it's not necessarily his fault, it's the story's fault for failing to properly accommodate him. The shift that takes place at the end of Twinside really reminds me of that one episode of The Office where Michael Scott takes improv classes.
Think about this. What is the most exciting thing that can happen on TV or in movies or in real life? Somebody has a gun. That's why I always start with a gun, because you can't top it. You just can't.
We started off this scene with a gun, but we didn't properly build up to it, so something just feels incomplete as a result. Now, I've obviously offered a lot of criticism towards Ultima's implementation in the story, but pointing out a problem is the easy part. How do I actually think Square could have implemented him in a way that would have made me enjoy him? A quick disclaimer before I continue. Not everything that I suggest is going to work perfectly within the already existing lore of the game, but accounting for everything that would have to change is significantly beyond my scope for this video, so we'll just have to accept that my solutions aren't a perfect cut and paste into the game. If you somehow haven't picked up on it, I very much wanted Anabella or any resemblance of the political themes to remain present in the final act. My first suggestion is simply for the game to acknowledge her after her death. Giving her arc some proper closure would allow me to actually move on from it and accept that Ultima is the new focus. Clive was abused and exploited by his mother for virtually his whole life. Joshua was effectively in exile for 18 years after the attack on Phoenix Gate. Jill was separated from her crush and taken prisoner by the Iron Kingdom, who enslaved her for the next 13 years. The 3 most active protagonists all had their lives completely upended by her, and, like Garnet in FF9, would benefit greatly from getting the time to actually acknowledge Anabella and her death. Ultima already references her in the interdimensional rift, but we could expand on this. Have him learn something about Anabella through Olivier and bring it up to Clive to really get under his skin, and actually have Clive and Joshua react to or even acknowledge it at all. These 2 changes would be relatively easy to fit into the game as is, as they don't really clash with anything already in the lore, and this would already be a significant improvement. But while I'm here, let's try some crazier ideas. I'm a bit conflicted regarding Barnabas. He was interesting enough earlier on, but I felt he grew less and less interesting as the game grew on. He serves 3 major roles. He's the king of Waloed, he's the dominant of darkness, bearing the power of Odin, and he has a close relationship with Ultima. We could potentially take one of these roles away from him to give to Anabella, giving her more of a role in the endgame. I don't think making her Queen of Waloed would make a ton of sense. A lot more hoops would need to be jumped through in order to fit that in, and I like the current idea of her being subtly manipulated by Ultima through Olivier without realizing it. So that rules out 1 and 3. But I could see a world where making her the dominant of Odin might work. Her marriage to Elwyn was already an arranged one, so keep that in but change her lineage. She could be from Waloed's royal family sent to marry Elwyn for political purposes to smooth over relations between Waloed and Rosaria. She could be a sibling to King Barnabas, who sold the kingdom to Ultima in her absence, leaving it in the Akashic state that it's already in. And when Ultima reveals himself after Dion kills Olivier, she realizes that, in addition to losing her son, husband, and power in Sanbreque, she also has no home to return to, potentially adding even more weight to her suicide. And then combine this with the first idea, of course, or else we're back in square one where she feels like she never existed in the first place after she dies. Honestly, this is the least fleshed out of my ideas, and by extent the one I'm least sure about, and it definitely requires the most rewriting in order to make work. My final thought is that the story stays more or less exactly the same up until Twinside, right after the Bahamut fight. Dion attacks Ultima/Olivier, and rather than disappearing, Ultima reveals himself and gives some exposition on who he is and what he's done. This is already an improvement, I think, as we have some context for who we're fighting and what we're fighting against. He's already revealed himself to Dion twice and Clive 3 times, and with one of the main villains exiting the story here, this would be a good opportunity to reveal and explain himself. But maybe we can take this idea a bit further even. Anabella originally kills herself here, but what if this wasn't the end of her? Piggybacking off my earlier suggestion of Ultima using Clive's trauma with his mother to get under his skin, what if as he revealed himself he reanimated her and infused her with power? Or stopped her from killing herself and used her as a vessel? Ultima's already been forced to shed his original body, and Anabella was the one who gave birth to Mythos, so maybe her body is also special and capable of hosting Ultima's spirit. Ultima doesn't need to inhabit her forever. He could perhaps discard her after the interdimensional rift and fight us on his own in Origin to allow him to distinguish himself from her in the final fight. And apart from some small dialogue changes, the sequence in Origin probably doesn't need to change very much. This obviously requires a lot more rewriting than my first suggestion, but I think it allows for the easiest transition between the last 2 acts of the story. It gives Anabella and Ultima some time to overlap and gives some more significance to Olivier's role as well. So, let me know in the comments, did any of what I said make any sense? It's really easy to criticize from my point of view. I'm just some guy with a YouTube channel. I don't have the pressure of millions of fans breathing down my neck to make a quote-unquote good Final Fantasy game, nor do I have the experience of writing stories or developing a game. All I do know for sure is that I was personally underwhelmed with the last act of Final Fantasy XVI, but like I said earlier, identifying the problem is significantly easier than coming up with a solution. So, going back to my original question, was Ultima really that bad? No, but that's also the frustrating part of it. At his core, I can't particularly find anything wrong with his character. Sure, I could probably nitpick a few things here and there, but that's true of virtually every single character ever written, so what really drags Ultima down is a poor transition over to his arc, leaving the story in a weird state where I'm still waiting for the previous arc to properly end, but it never does, and so I'm not quite ready to emotionally invest in the next one. I guess the video did end up being largely about Anabella as well, so looks like she did get her video after all, just not the one I imagined I'd make.